everybody, welcome to my channel. My name's Fiddle. Today we are going to be making homemade cold porcelain clay, talk about the ups and downs of it, and make a holiday dinner. Don't forget to check the link in the description. It'll take you to the Scavenger Hunt where you can find the list of materials and supplies that you'll need for this as well. And I also added a few printables of cookies just in case you wanted to make some for yourself. We're going to start by making our clay with a few simple ingredients. Into a medium saucepan, start by adding 1 cup of cornstarch, 1 cup of white glue, 1 tablespoon vinegar. I have used pickle juice and it did work. And no, it didn't smell like pickles either. And lastly, 1 tablespoon of coconut oil. Mix them all together while your pan is heating on medium. After you've gotten it mixed together, grab some saran wrap or grocery bag, and if you use a grocery bag, tear off the print or any labeling that's on it because that'll stick to your clay. Then grab the lotion and spread it around on the plastic like you're greasing a pan. Now go back and stir your clay. If you wanted to make a full batch of one color of clay, you can add inks or food coloring during the cooking process. But because we need a whole bunch of different colors, we're going to leave ours white. You'll notice when your clay starts to change because it'll turn colors from a white to a yellow off-white and it'll start to stick together. When about 80% of it has started to change, plop it out onto your plastic and let it sit there for a few minutes. While that's cooling, go back and clean your pan. Try to get as much as you can off before even touching it with water or putting it in the sink. This stuff is not dishwasher or disposal safe. But your pan won't be ruined. You can still use it for food afterwards. It's just not too great on household appliances. When you're finished washing your pan, go back to your clay. You want it to be cool enough that you can handle it, but still pretty warm. Add lotion to your hands and start working the clay. The lotion acts as like a grease barrier so that way it doesn't stick to you. And yes, it will be a little bit of a gooey mess, but keep working, you're doing it right. When you have it all combined together, rub lotion over it one more time, wrap the plastic around it, getting all the air out, tie it closed with a rubber band, and then put it in a sealed Tupperware container. You can store it in the fridge if you'd like, but I just keep mine on my craft shelf. This stuff can keep on the shelf for 6 months up to a year. I have seen articles online that say to let it cure for 24 hours before using it, but I usually start using mine right away. It's completely up to you if you wait or not. Next, we're going to talk about tools. These are the ones that I use the most, and yes, that is just a clear piece of plastic down there at the bottom. I like using it better to cut than I do the blade or a knife. Sometimes the most random of things can get the job done, like a bottle cap ring or a thread spool. You will also be able to see this photo just in case you need more time to look at it over on Patreon. Just follow the link in the description. Okay, are you ready to get started? The first thing we're going to do is make the cloves and start the onions. We're going to need just a bit of white clay and we're going to make teeny tiny little balls. I would say around 15 to 20 of them, 4 or 5 for the onions and the rest for cloves. They don't have to be perfectly round, just teeny tiny little dots. When you have them all made up, separate the ones you want to use for onions. You'll need to come back and add a layer after we complete each task. If you've seen my roast tutorial, we're doing exactly the same thing. Because I had onions left over from then, I didn't go through the process of recording me making new ones. Every time you see this little guy come across the screen, you need to add another layer to your onion. His animation's a little crude, but it's not as bad in the original. I have no idea what changed between this and that. But anyway, once you have your tiny balls made, set them aside and we're going to grab our extruder. If you don't have one, you can just roll out a snake of clay because we are just using a single round dot. We are going to be making the marshmallows for the sweet potato casserole. When you're not using clay, wrap it back up in plastic or cover it with a glass cup. The less time in open air, the better. And don't forget to clean your tools after use. I accidentally left some clay in that thing before. It was fun to clean out. While your clay is still soft, use a tool to cut out little pieces and use your fingers to round the edges, but we don't want to make balls. We want them to look like marshmallows. I made round about 100, but 50 should get you there. I made some even tinier marshmallows than this by using the smaller bit for the extruder. Quite honestly, I don't think you can even tell that I used different sizes in it. Just a thought, if you wanted to make a cup of hot cocoa, which isn't a bad idea, I might do that. They don't have to look perfect, but as long as they look something like a marshmallow, you're on the right track. Before we start the next task, go back and add a layer around your onions. It doesn't have to be centered or perfect, but you want to make sure the ball that you're adding is bigger than the ball you started with. If you would like yellow onions instead of white ones, color the ball yellow before adding the next layer of clay. Okay, back to what we were doing. Now we are going to start the sweet potatoes themselves. To begin, we have to color the clay. And for that, alcohol markers are the best bet. Regular markers will bleed onto your other clay or even into your sauces. I found that out with the green bean casserole. To get the right color for the sweet potatoes, I went with reds and oranges and a little bit of yellow. Alright, let's talk about bringing clay back to life. One thing that will happen is it will start to dry out. When that starts to happen, add a bit of glue and work it back into it. It'll be a sticky mess for a minute, but once it's worked in, your clay will be softer. If you've added too much glue or your clay is too soft, you can stiffen it back up by adding cornstarch, but do it a little at a time or you might dry it out too fast. This is also a good way to create texture in the clay, like we would need for the sweet potatoes. When you have it the consistency and color you want, you can mash it into your pan, whatever you're choosing as a dish to put it in. I'm using a clear plastic lid, but this isn't my final container. I was actually surprised to find out that it fits inside of my bowls that I made in one of my past tutorials. We want to fill our containers just under the edge to leave enough space for the marshmallows on top. If you have or you're familiar with resin, I would suggest using it. If not, you can go the route I went. To make like a melted marshmallow stuff, I used matte white paint and clear Elmer's glue. This gives us the opaque for the marshmallow and the glossy for the melted part. Use a bit to cover the marshmallows to get them all the same color and kind of give them a melty look. Next, take a bit and paint it over top of it. You want it to be a little bit thick so it'll grab a hold of the marshmallows and look more gooey. One of the things that you have to prepare yourself for or be expecting with this clay is shrinkage. It does shrink a good bit. The way to account for that is to make whatever you want to make a smidge bigger than what you want it. And even more so if you want to make a mold of something, because when you make the mold, it has to be twice as big because there will be shrinkage from the original than from the clay that you put in the mold. I had to do quite a bit of experimenting when I made the molds for my roasts that were in my shop. Once you have your layer of paint laid down, we can add the marshmallows. I just put them one layer thick on mine, but if you want to mound yours up, you can. Okay, now that we're this far, it looks pretty good, but to make it look even better, take a spoon and take a little scoop out of it to make it look like someone's already dipped in it. Sorry about the horrible lighting. I have tried fixing it and it just does not work. Thankfully, it's just this clip. Anyway, this not only gives you a view of the sweet potatoes, but it also pulls the paint down in the hole to really get that gooey look. Set it aside to dry and we'll come back to it later. Now we're ready to start the biscuit, but don't forget to add a layer to your onions. We're going to start with 3 medium balls of clay and 3 markers in cream tan color, a bright yellow, and an off-white yellowish color. Sorry you can't see them. We want to try to get the look of buttery, flaky biscuits, and layering the colors this way, we'll be able to get that effect. Start by using one color for each ball. Once you have your colors set, roll each ball out flat. We want them thin but not so thin that they stick to the plastic and tear. Then layer them one on top of another, cut them in half and repeat the process until you get as many layers as you want. Roll it out a bit thicker than what you want your biscuits, and then we're going to use some sort of round tool to cut our biscuits out. I used a cheap spool thread. Crayola fat marker lid would be another good thing that you could use. Try to get as many biscuits out as you can before you ball the clay up and roll it out again. And I will say that as you roll and the more that you make, it will mix the clay together until it's all the same color, which in the end is really okay because we're also going to be using chalk pastels on these. And you can always color more clay to make the layers if you wanted. I made around 20 biscuits with just that little bit of clay. When you have them all cut out, we can start making the detail. I used my clear plastic edge and made light lines into the side. I found it easier to just go a little bit at a time until you go all the way around and repeat the process until you're happy with the amount of lines. Also, I should have all of my little biscuits underneath of something. An upside down container would work good. Sometimes I even add a dab of glue on the inside of it somewhere so that way there's extra moisture in there, especially if I want the clay to stay really soft because I'm not done working with it. Which brings me to my next tip. If your clay starts to dry out, but it's not really enough to need the glue, you can use lotion to soften your clay back up a little bit. And as I said, you can put it on the inside of a turned upside down container to keep moisture in for your clay to stay soft. And it will also help put a barrier between the clay and your tools to make them easier to clean later. Set them aside to dry, wrap a layer around your onions, and then we're going to start working on the ham. We got to build this guy from the inside out, starting with the bone first. Using our handy dandy piece of clear plastic, roll out a snake of clay. Using the plastic keeps the shape uniform all the way along, whereas if we used our hands, we would have lumps and bumps. Next, cut your end flat. Then use a pokey tool. You could even use a ballpoint pen or even a pencil to make a small indent in both ends. It may start to flare out a little bit, but that's okay if it does. Sorry, this shot's not the greatest. I am working on getting a better camera. And if you would like to help support me make better videos, go check out Patreon. There's some new things that you can get, including a free coloring page drawn by me every month. Once you have your bones indented, set them aside. We need them to be bone dry before we can use them. I would say give it a good 24 hours. When our bones are dry, we need to mix up colors of clay. We're going to need different variations of pink and red all the way to white. I think I had 5 altogether. Oh, and the friendly reminder to keep your clay wrapped up when you're not using it. We're going to start with the darkest color, red, and wrap the bone in it. It's okay if you cover the ends, we'll find them later. Then take your next lightest color and add another layer. Okay, we need to add a little bit of fat in here. Take just a little bit of your white and roll it out. We want it to be pretty thin. Grab your second to lightest pink and add a little bit of it to it too. But we don't want to roll this pink out. We want to leave it pretty clumpy, and we're not wrapping it around either. We're just setting it there on top to give like this little pink area to it. Next, roll out a little bit of the same color pink and wrap it around. We have one more layer to roll out and add, and that is the skin layer. You'll want it to be a smidge bit thicker than the other layers that we've done. Now we're ready to put it in its final shape. Use your fingers and press lightly all the way around until you get it into a cone shape, and you'll want to bring the bone to the front fat end. It may take you a bit of time to get the bone there, but keep working at it. And this will also help get out any air bubbles and blend your edges between your clay a little. Also, now is a good time to be thinking about how big you actually want your ham to be. Your container size will also be a factor in how big you can make your meat. I am using one of those cheap little plastic sewing kit bottoms as a pan, but I do have a pattern for an aluminum pan if you would like to make one. I will put a link down in the description box for that. Working your way to the back end of the ham, find your bone again, and you can cut a bit off if you want here. I actually had enough leftover clay that I made a whole nother ham. When you've got it to the size and shape you want, we're ready to do the texturing. But before we do that, we need to soften the clay up again. And what we need to do is just rub some lotion all over it and let it sit for a few minutes. I think I forgot to add this piece to your list of materials, but you will need some sort of netting. This is actually from a thing of garlic. Lightly roll it up in the mesh, pressing with your fingers. This will give us the start to our hash pattern. If your clay is still a little too soft to touch it without taking away the pattern, let it sit for a minute or two. In order to make the bones stick out a little more and to fill your pan up, we need to cut some slices off the front of this. Plus, it'll help make it look a little better too. This first one you probably won't want to keep unless you use the other side. And we'll also be able to see how our layering went. I took about 4 or 5 slices off of mine, but I also used some from the other hams that I've made. When you have all the slices cut off that you want, we need to texture the flat end of the meat. We don't have to go too far into detail here, just a few lines. To get the deep spiral cuts, I took my plastic and went around the outside at an angle. If you want to get deep cuts, cut all the way through the first layer. I did this in a few places and I really liked the way that it looked. Once you've gone all the way around in one direction, change your angle and go the other. Let it dry for a full 24 hours before moving on to the next step because we're ready to color. And yes, I know I'm using Crayola. I still stand by what I said. Alcohol marker is still the best to use for this. It became a mess when I added the glaze, but honestly it didn't mess it up or change the outcome any, thankfully. And with this we are just coloring the outside skin layer. Don't color the front or the back end where the meat has been cut. Set it aside for a minute and we're going to start making the gravy. You'll need a bit of clear glue and some chalk and a few different variations of brown. And as I said before, if you are familiar with resin, this would be a good opportunity to use it. For the next part, you'll need a fine tip tool. Our goal is to try to get the juices inside the cracks. If it gets other places, that's okay. It'll still look good in the end. Set it aside to dry for a few minutes and we're going to color our cloves. You'll want it to be a little bit darker brown than the ham itself. I had to put them in another container to finish coloring them. When I did, you couldn't see what I was doing. Okay, we're ready to make the pineapple. For this, you're going to need some yellow clay and a round cutting tool. I'm using my spool. For the pineapples, you'll want to cut them out one at a time, not as a group, because we have to work with them individually. We want them to still be soft when we go to stick them on the ham so they don't crack or break. To make them really look like pineapples, I took my clear plastic edge and made little indents, but I made sure to go all the way across the whole piece at an even level, being sure not to cut all the way through. To cut out the center, I used a vape juice bottle lid nib. You can use just about anything to get that hole in the center, even a pointy tool or a pencil. We have to add one more little bit of detail before we can add it to the ham, and that is to go around the edge where we cut it out initially and put a few little indents in the sides. Add the pineapple to the clay and then put the clove on top. We wanted to add the cloves while the clay is still soft so it sits down in and not lays. Repeat the process until you've put as many pineapple on the ham as you want. I think I did about 15 altogether, and I made some extras to put down in the pan. We are ready to make the cherries. You'll need some silica beads and a red marker. We're going to color them just like we did the cloves. These are really great for making tiny food, although you do have to beware because they are toxic, so you need to keep them away from little ones. I almost forgot that we need to color the pineapple before we add the cherries. For the center of each pineapple, you want to add just a dab of red, and around the outside edges, you want to add orange. This will make them, 1, look like they're cooked, and 2, like the cherry juices got on the pineapples. It's a small but important detail and helps it look more realistic. If you've made any extra ones, this would be a good time to go ahead and color those too. Okay, now we can add the cherries. I used a dab of super glue in the center of the pineapple and stuck the cherry right in it. The ham is almost finished, just a few things left to do. We need to color the edges of our slices that we're going to put in our pan. The last thing we have to do is lay down a bit of gravy in the bottom of our pan and arrange our food where we want it. It took me a good minute to figure out where exactly to put mine, and I couldn't be happier with the way that it turned out. Now we're ready to start the green beans. We're going to need our extruder and one of the ones with tiny little holes. We'll only be extruding the clay a little at a time. Let's say about 2 green bean lengths long. Try to say that 10 times fast. But we want it to as long because we want to grab it at both ends and then pull it apart. This will keep it pointed and look more like fresh green beans rather than canned cut ones. When you have all of them made, set them aside so they can dry. I would say about a day or so. While we're waiting, our biscuits should be dry enough that we can paint them. For this, I'm using a brown chalk pastel and a makeup brush. A makeup brush does work better than a watercolor paintbrush, but it would work too. We just want to bring out the lines and add a little bit to the tops and bottoms. Now that our biscuits are done, we should be able to move on to our sweet potatoes. I used a torch to get the actual burn look and then later came in with chalk pastels to do a little bit of dusting. Please watch your fingers and do it in a well ventilated area. I made a few of them to figure out which way I liked it better, and this is the one that I liked the most, but I'm not quite sure what happened to it after I made it. It disappeared. Anyway, now that the sweet potato's done, we can move on to the crust for the onions on the green bean casserole. You'll need a white fine grained sand and we're going to color it with markers. We want it to look like breadcrumbs, so it's okay if not all of it gets colored, but I went through quite a few different colors of orange and yellow, including the ones that I used for the biscuits. Our green beans should be dry enough now that we can put them in our bowl. We need just enough to fill it up. Now we're ready to make the gravy. For this one I used white paint and clear glue again, but we want way more clear glue than we do paint. Unlike the marshmallows, we want the green beans to stay green. Then add a little bit of black chalk. This will lightly color the paint glue green and leave little chunks and look like mushrooms in it. Give it a good stir and then add the green beans to it. Stir again, then pour it in your bowl. If you think your gravy is too white, you can go back and add more clear glue, and that'll help lighten it up a little bit. When you go to put them in the pan, you want to try to get all the air bubbles out. I had quite a few of them, but eventually I had to add more gravy anyways, and that helps clear them up. Once your bowls are ready, we can do the onions. I'm really excited for these. I enjoy making them for some weird reason. I guess it's because you really don't expect them to come out looking like they do. I used an easy cutter to cut mine. You can use an X-Acto, kitchen knife, whatever you would like. Just steer clear of your fingers. We want to cut them in little slivers. I did that by slicing them and then cutting them in half. Now we're going to bread them by dipping them in glue and then into our breadcrumbs or sand. The old shake and bake commercial comes to mind. When you have them breaded, we can go ahead and put them on top. If you need to, you can add a little bit more gravy so that way they stick. And it's okay if the onions aren't completely covered. I think it looks more realistic if you see a little bit of it shining through. Yay, and the green bean casserole is done. If you try it, please send me a picture. I want to see what it turns out like. We have one more dish to make, and that is dessert. For this, we're going to be making an apple pie. For this, you'll need a pale yellow colored clay. You can get that by taking yellow and just barely coloring the clay with it. Mix it really well before you add more so that way you don't get too yellow. Another thing to point out with this clay is that it will dry darker than what the color is when you first apply it. So the wet clay will look a little bit different than the dry clay. Roll out a thin piece of your clay, and this is going to be the bottom of our pie crust. You'll have to pull the edges straight up and use your finger to push the clay down into the bottom corners. You want to make sure that it's pretty close to it because we will get shrinkage. You can also use the ball tool here, but I find it easier just to use my fingers. Once you have the crust down inside, use the edge to cut off the excess. To make the apples, I used a light cream color, but honestly, you could just leave them white. I used the half moon extruder bit, but if you do not have an extruder, you can roll out a snake of clay and cut it in half. Keep it in a cane like this and let it dry for a full 24 hours. Then come back through with some sort of cutting tool and cut your little slices. You'll need enough to fill your pie crust, and it looks even cuter if it's got a little bit of a mound of apples inside of it. One last thing that I wanted to talk about with this clay while we're cutting away, and that is warpage. You may have noticed when you let your apples dry in that cane that it kind of bent and changed shape. And I think out of everything with this clay, that is the one major downfall. You can always account for shrinkage by just making your pieces a smidge bit bigger, but for warpage it's a little bit harder because you have to keep an eye on your pieces that are drying. A lot of times if you want a large piece to lay out flat, you'll have to flip it back and forth during the drying process. And with overnight drying, that's a little bit difficult. I figured this out when I made the gingerbread house and the cookies. The house, I let the walls of it dry flat and flip them back and forth because it was during the day. However, when I went to finish it and I laid down the cake at the bottom, it ended up warping over a few days, and this is what it ended up looking like. Granted, yes, it is still cute and it kind of looks like they're on a hill, but that wasn't what I was going for. To make up a little bit of a sauce for the apples, we're going to use clear glue again and a little bit of brown chalk pastels to make it look like it's got cinnamon in it. If you would like to give it a little bit of an added touch, you could actually add cinnamon to it now, and it will give it the smell and definitely the look like it is an apple pie. I have also used vanilla extract in my berry pies. Pour your apple mix into your pie crust, and we're going to make the top crust now. I made mine a simple lattice, but if you want to get creative and make something different, go for it. I've made some pretty fancy ones in the past. It's completely up to you. Add it to the top of your pie and trim the edges. We have one more bit of clay left to add, and that is the crust around the edge. I used my wavy cutter. There are so many different ways that you can make it. Add it around the edge of your pie and we are almost done. Before we can give it the last color to make it look like it's baked, we gotta let it dry for a good day or so. This is what it looks like before it's dry and before we add color for baking. Okay, now on to color. The way to make this look like a real pie that's been baked, we want to add a brown to the high points over top of the lattice pieces and all the way around the outside edge. How dark you want to make it is completely up to you. Now using a lighter tan color, go in and blend out the dark marker that you used. I have seen some people use chalk pastels here, but for me I have found it to work a lot better with markers. If you were to use a powder, it'll get down inside where the apple is and cover it up, and it'll just make it look like a muddy mess. It's a lot easier and a lot cleaner if you use markers. And here is the final look for the pie, and with that it brings us to the end of our tutorial. I am sorry that it took so long to get it out. I went through quite a few different problems with it, and thankfully I persevered and got through it, and I'm so glad that I did. I really hope you enjoyed it, and if you made it this far, thank you for being here. And if you're not already, please consider becoming a subscriber, as it really helps me out a lot. And if you would like to support me more and to see more things like this, please consider becoming a member over on Patreon. There are quite a few benefits to it. The next tutorial will be a school desk and chalkboard. Thank you, Ginger, and I'll see you next time.